let's start with the title. How does the title strike you? What do you find interesting about the title? Is theology poetry?
Is it begging for a definition of terms?
It definitely does. At least that's how Lewis begins. He wants to make clear how he's going to use these terms. What else does the title suggest?
Seems to be associating two things that you wouldn't normally associate.
Why is that? Why would we not associate theology and poetry?
Because sometimes poetry is thought of as imaginative and not true.
Okay.
And it's an attempt to trap Lewis.
Okay. So the entrapment goes how? How does the entrapment go? How do you think it would go? If he didn't define his terms and didn't recognize what's going on, because it is indeed a very tricky question, then what do you think the entrapment is?
That theology is not dealing with things that might be true.
So if you say theology is like poetry, then you would be saying?
But poetry has truth too, so it's still complicated.
It's of the imagination. It's fantasy.
Fantasy, not real, not true. Is that implication here?
Well, maybe poetry is created by man, whereas we see theology as God's teaching.
Okay, so from the maybe the theological side of the house, to call it poetry would be to say that it can't have anything to say about God. From the literature side of the house, if we say that it's like poetry, we might be saying that it has nothing to say about reality. Are you getting the feel of this? But it's actually more complicated than that.
Well, they're structural too. I mean, we look at the Psalms as poetic, but the Book of Kings is historical.
So in terms of form, how do we understand the Bible in terms of literary genres?
There are parts of the Bible that we consider have poetic form.
But does that make them untrue?
No.
Oh, but the implication that poetry is not really about reality other than my feelings or something of the sort.
Well, we presume, I think the presumption is that poetry is words, but I think that's much too narrow. There's poetry of motion. There's poetry in nature. Poetry is symmetry. It's beauty. It's things that go together in a miraculous way.
Okay.
It can be described in words,
Okay.
but poetry is not just words. Poetry is things that exist in our world that maybe we can't explain, but they go together so beautifully.
Are they factual? What's the presumption of our age?
Isn't it more feelings?
More feelings.
Emotion. It's
So that list of things at the top of the handout is why we're talking about it like this right now. Before these guys, we wouldn't be talking about it like this at all. Okay? So this lineup, from David Hume to John Stuart Mill to Charles Darwin to Bertrand Russell to Lewis, right there where I put his dates, and his contemporary A.J. Ayer, is the reason why this question was posed and why it seems so tricky to us. And division goes back to David Hume, who separated two things by arguing that these two things were the only appropriate things to which our intellect could be properly used. Matters of relation, that's logic and tautologies, and for Hume, mathematics. So bachelors are adult unmarried men. We say, yes, that's true. We don't need sense experience to know that. It's found in the definition of the word bachelor, right? And once you know that definition, then what you're saying is A equals A. That's a tautology. Or mathematics. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Unless you talk to a mathematician, that most usually does it for us, right? So those for Hume were matters of relation. They had no reference to facts derived by sense experience. Matters of fact, however, are by Hume confined only to those things that we can know by our senses, what we can see, touch, feel, and handles. Period. So, how does poetry fit into that definition? How does Wordsworth fit into that definition? Let's just not be abstract. How does a vision of the countryside in England fit into that definition? Is that fact? He looked, he saw, he experienced, but is the poetry fact? Is the poetry measurable?
Well, it can be.
You can measure what in the parable, in the poetry? The meter?
Right. The pentameter, the meter.
But that's not the poetry, is it? That's an analysis of the
Well,
poetry.
that's the form.
That's the analogy of the
That's
form.
of the
But
words.
is the poetry measuring the nature that the poet is seeing?
Well, if you think of poetry as in the same relation as a painting, it's an image of something. And it reaches the audience at a level that differs from person to person.
But Hume would say the painting is not reality. It's not what you see, touch, feel, and handle. It is merely the poet's eye of that reality. And that then would be seen as a matter of value. And he separates value and fact. Facts are true and false. Values are just about what we feel at the moment and nothing more.
I think it's helpful to understand the split if we go even further back to Occam
Oh, yes.
and the nominalism,
Yes.
which really begins the severing of the two stories, as Schaeffer would put it.
Yes.
Because he
Ooh.
separates
Nice.
language from the things themselves. Our names are arbitrarily, there's no actual inherent meaning in the thing itself. That's really the beginning of this split,
Yes.
and we can see then how we say our poetry, our language, does not properly name things
That's
anymore.
right.
It's in the upper story of our values and our feelings. And so how are we going to know actual reality? Well, we're going to need to just use mathematics,
Exactly.
measurement. And so going all the way back to Occam, I think, helps understand the beginning of the split a little bit better and see how Lewis is being forced into this dualism through the question, right? Does theology belong in the upper or the lower story?
Exactly. By the way, Occam died from the Black Plague in 1348. You understand how far back this goes? Okay.
It took a while to percolate.
Okay, it just kind of made its way, because Occam's hard. You read Occam? Occam's hard, and his logic is hard. And it took a long way for nominalism, that's what it's called, that there are no universals, there's just the names we arbitrarily give to things, no matter what. And those names can be changed in a whim. I wonder if we know any instances in our time like that. But anyway, now you know where that came from. Okay. So that's the dilemma facing Jack. When this little slip of paper is handed to him, is theology poetry? Okay? It's a very serious dilemma. And his contemporary at Oxford, A.J. Ayer, has now put that dilemma on the front burner of 20th century philosophy in England, at least. A.J. Ayer is a major figure at Oxford and a major figure in Anglo-American analytic philosophy. And he has made this the centerpiece of his arguments. And so Lewis is aware of this. So, back down to Roman numeral 3, let's define some terms. So how does Lewis define what he means by theology? At least initially.
The systematic series of statements about God and about man's relation to him,
Okay?
which the believers of religion make.
So kind of a systematic series of statements about what believers and religious folks think about God. Just that. Now he's going to give us a little bit more later, but that's a good place to start. We can talk about theology in various forms. Systematic theology would be a systematic ordering of those statements about God that believers sometimes make. Now, how does he go about defining poetry? And remember, his first desire was to be a poet. He was actually a fine poet.
This is writing which arouses and in part satisfies the imagination.
Tied to the imagination. But is that all he says? What makes poetry a little bit more difficult to define? Well, we've already talked about that a little bit. We've already talked about truth in poetry, but that's not factually or empirically rooted truth. Imagination is a little harder to pin down, isn't it? What do we mean by that? And how does it function? And how do we know what arouses or the ways in which our imagination may work at a given time might change? So he then turns to how do we think about theology in light of these definitions? Okay? So, the very end of page 117. Does Christian theology owe its attraction to its power of arousing and satisfying our imaginations? Are those who believe it mistaking aesthetic enjoyment for intellectual assent? Or assenting simply because they enjoy? So this adds another dimension to the question. It's along the lines of just how good a poetry is theology after all. How many of you read a systematic theology text in your life? Anybody? Just how poetic was that? Let's just be honest. Was it? Did it remind you of the best of Dante?
Not so much.
Shelley? No?
Not so
Malcolm
much.
Guite? No? So Lewis then begins to say, well, if theology is poetry, it's not very good poetry. Okay? So what's the argument here? What's the point? This would be on page 118 and 19. Why isn't it not good poetry?
We have different pages.
Our pages.
Okay, your pages are different. Okay, so this would be 3 and 4. Okay? All right. I didn't keep one of the ones I handed out to you. There's a reason why I had one copy.
Helps you feel me.
Okay, so if you look at the top of your number 3 of the printout, and some of you have the book, and that's page 118, and some of you are online, and there are no pages there. It's about 3 pages in. So how does the doctrine of Trinity line up as good poetry?
Well, he says it's not very satisfying.
Why
It's
not?
poetry. It's not tidy.
That's a nice way of putting it.
He says it's neither completely put together or rich. He says the other side that's appealing is complexity, that you can lose yourself in.
Yes.
And it's neither.
It's neither.
So,
But it's both.
or it can be, well, according to Lewis, at least his initial statement.
Yes, so I've only managed to read half confession. Confession.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if he changes his opinion here, because I was surprised, in a sense, for him to make these aesthetic valuations, unless he's doing it for a rhetorical point. But it does seem to me that the doctrine of the, and here, again, is he talking about theology in terms of how it's given to us in a systematic theology book?
Yes.
Or is he talking about the doctrine of the Trinity itself, which is a wellspring of poetic reality? And I think like David Bentley Hart might have something different to say about
He would always have something to say.
the poetic quality of the Trinity, right? And even Lewis in like Paralandra, Christianity has both the classical simplicity and the Gothic richness, and it combines them in the both and, right? So I was surprised to see him saying this, wondering if by the end of the essay he changes his tune, or is Or is he just is he kind of throwing this bone to make a point to his audience?
Well, let's see. You've asked a great question. Let's just see how it goes.
Isn't it more, though, like the comparison of poetry and, say, physics? Would you want a poet that designed an airplane? Do you want to get on that airplane? I'm not so sure. I want someone who knows his engineering and knows his math and the reality there, that tangible kind of reality. I think that's really what the question is really going after, the tangible reality of a theology versus our understanding of it, which is legitimate, but it's not, whether you see it poetically or you see it in the systematic theology, that's the same thing, and it's different ways of having it mean something to you.
But we understand these Norse gods and Greek gods as mythical, but Christianity is different. We have a different understanding of
With
that.
Einstein,
Historical basis.
your greatest physicists have a sense of the poetic. It's
Oh, yeah.
often their sense of the poetic that brings them through new breakthroughs in their discipline.
Well, I think his intent here is rhetoric, and he will go on to make his point.
Yeah, he could have just said yes or no. I mean, that was one option.
Which is pretty profound.
Just say yes or no. But instead, he brings you through his thinking.
Yeah.
And it is a bit of a trick, because he brings you up to a point and you, yes, 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 oh. And I need to go back to Aachen again, because I'm concerned about the names in the Bible and the Hebrew are exceedingly important. I am.
Yes.
Your entire presentation last night, I think, was a beautiful description of the importance of the names to C.S. Lewis. They do mean something. They're not just arbitrary. They actually have a meaning. And the sensitivity that we can't even call God by his name, it is so precious. And then Jesus, Peter, you will be the rock. So to me, those names and what they represent, and then in the poetry of this, are crucial, because they do point to what, I mean, they're pointing to the answer.
But in the context of mid-20th century philosophy, and actually 21st century philosophy, it's all arbitrary. It can be changed in a moment. It can be changed in a moment, and it does not reflect reality at all. In fact, Richard Rorty, before his death in 2005, said, "There is no truth, there's no meaning, there's no purpose. Have a few laughs, you're going to die."
Did he say there's no death?
No, he believed that there was death, but he didn't think there was a thing after that.
Right.
Okay?
In 1944, was the poetry very much influenced by this?
It was.
More of it was.
It was certainly an issue in the poetry. So some of the mid-20th century poetry says that what we do just defines things the way we want to define it. Yeah. Yes. And you can catch some of that even earlier with T.S. Eliot's poetry before he becomes a Christian. Prufrock is a perfect example of that. And The Wasteland is a perfect example of that. So, not perfect, huh?
Well, I think there's all sorts of prophecies and prefigurings of Eliot's conversion in The Wasteland.
Mm-hmm.
So
He's struggling. He's struggling.
Well, I think he's come out of the struggle. I think he already knows where he's going, and I think he's already rejected. I think The Wasteland is an expose of this 20th century philosophy.
That's a very good way of reading it. So the part right where we are right now, Lewis's point is really pretty simple, and it's a rhetorical point. If it's poetry, it's not nearly as rich and as detailed and extravagant as the kind of stuff that comes out of pantheism or the kind of things that comes out of polytheism. And the classic imagination is far richer, far more varied, far more elaborate, and you can lose yourself in that. And if that's your measure of poetry, then the kind of thing that we typically try to boil down in a theology text is not that rich in that respect. So then he ends this section, and this would be in the end of the first long paragraph on your page 3. But Christian theology does not cater very well to either. That is, the Romantic imagination or the classical imagination. And if Christianity is only a mythology, like the classical imagination would have expressed, then I find the mythology I believe in is not the one I like best. I like Greek mythology much better, Irish still better, Norse best of all. I mean, if you really want real mythology, give me Thor, That's what he's saying. So as he looks at this, he's not quite to his point, but he's getting us ready for his point. He goes on to say, well, have we always liked this kind of mythology? Have we always enjoyed it? Or do our tastes change? What happens? Do we still like reading Greek mythology? So, at the top of the next page, yeah. It looks as if the confusion between imaginative enjoyment and intellectual assent of which Christians are accused is not nearly so common or so easy as some people suppose. Even children, I believe, rarely suffer from it. It pleases their imagination to pretend that they are bears or horses, but I do not remember that one was ever under the least delusion. May it not even be that there is something in belief which is hostile to perfect imaginative enjoyment. The sensitive, cultivated atheist seems to, at times, to enjoy the aesthetic trappings of Christianity in a way which the believer can only envy. The modern poets certainly enjoy the Greek gods in a way which I find no trace in Greek literature. So, what do you think he's doing in here? He's getting ready for something, a new turn in his argument, but what do you think he's doing? What's the point of this?
It sounds like he's making that point, that you can enjoy something more if you don't necessarily believe it's true.
So there's something different about enjoyment and belief. So to reduce belief to enjoyment might be a mistake. Perhaps. Belief is more than just enjoyment. So he said, I don't want to be accused of going too far. I've suggested belief spoils a system for imagination in a certain sense, but not all senses. So he begins to then talk about Midsummer Night's Dream and other works, maybe a kind of pleasure in learning about the Napoleonic Wars, and maybe even some sort of enjoyment in the next page of thinking about various systems of theology or philosophy, life force, religion, Marxism, Freudianism. They all become poetic or poetries to their own believers. But does this capture it? Okay, does this capture it? So what I want you to see him doing is shaving away things, okay? Sort of like an artist might do who is sculpting a statue, shaving away the things that are not David, okay?
Scott, isn't he also perhaps turning the table on the questioner?
Yes.
Because, you know, it's not a theology poetry, and it's a trick question, like how often do you beat your wife, okay?
Yes.
So the point is, what he's done here is separate the two, first of all, right? Theology and poetry are not the same thing. Systematic theology and poetry are not the same thing, right? And then he's saying basically, well, your beliefs are poetic.
Yes.
Now, if you're a Marxist or a Freudian or an
Yes,
empiricist,
right.
to you,
Yes.
those beliefs are poetic. It's actually turned the thing completely on its head.
That's right.
And he's accusing them of the very thing that they've accused him of, basically.
Exactly.
And this is very prescient. It anticipates the future. The high point of materialism was the late 40s. This was written in the mid-40s, I think.
Yes.
Or early 50s. In the early 50s, materialism, the ship of materialism hit an iceberg, hit several icebergs, and it's starting to go down, actually. The real problems, major problems surfaced in the idea of Darwinism and in the idea of cosmology. If you've read some of the literature, you recognize that all the physical, there are like 20 or 30 physical constants, and to say that the universe is balanced on a knife is grossly underestimating. Just tiny changes in any of the physical constants would make life impossible. We can't explain that. The other thing is the complexity of the cell. In Darwin's time, cells were thought to be undifferentiated pieces of jelly. If you took one of your 100 trillion cells in your body and looked at it, it would look like London. It's that complicated. And we continue every year, it becomes more and more and more complicated. We have no explanation for it. It's just words. The emperor has no clothes. And the other thing is the cells all talk to each other. So the idea that the universe is just sprang into being for no reason, and that that all this complexity originated from nothing, all this massive amount of information, which almost certainly exceeds the volume of information in the Library of Congress in your cell. It just came about from nothing. Madness. Anyway.
So that's a nice segue to the next section of the essay, actually, because Lewis then tells the scientific story. He calls it the scientific mythology, the scientific outlook. He's using that word in a way that's consistent with H.G. Wells and other people in the first part of the 20th century. What does this outlook say? What is this story? And he presents it like a narrative, like a story. This is the mythology of the scientific outlook in terms of the outline I gave you. So what's that story like? Part of it's what we've heard. What's the rest of that story like?
This is where he is turning it on the head and saying, you believe this because it's poetic.
Yes.
Because it's
Yeah, it is.
satisfying.
Yeah.
Poetically very satisfying.
And then he
No.
gives
It's a story.
this little subtle thing at the end of it, in terms of fact. I believe less than half of what it tells me about the past.
That's right.
And he says that, it's a heroic scenario. Eventually the sun burns out and Dyke dies.
It is a tragic story in the
That's why
end.
Carl Sagan is so brilliant.
Yeah.
He
Billions and
spoke to the
billions.
imaginative.
So by the time you get to the end of this modern scientific story, there's just ruin and disaster. Nothing's left. It ends with that story of tragedy.
Which is why Nietzsche's work is so powerful and influential. He was the poet. I mean, you hear Lewis picking up on Nietzschean poetics to develop this narrative. Right? That's what gives him his power.
Well-
We're going to face this meaningless.
The grandeur
The
of
courage.
the Übermensch hero.
Well, and Wagner. So he ends this little part with a quote from Wagner.
It's a good place.
Okay.
Always a good place.
I saw the world end. I saw the
Is that
world
the
end.
German? Or?
Yes, that's what the German is. That's the very end of the Ring operas. And they were intensely popular in the first part of the 20th century and played often in England, and Lewis had seen them. And so it all ends while Holland burns up, there's nothing left. Okay? And the music is heroic and moving and dramatic, and the stage is on fire. So that's the modern.
So at this point, we've got to is scientism poetry?
Yes, that's where we got. Exactly. See how he turns it? It's beautiful. It's brilliant. It's wonderful. Okay, so next. This is the bottom of page 7 for you guys. We cannot, therefore, turn down theology simply because it does not avoid being poetical. All worldviews yield poetry to those who believe them by the mere fact of being believed. And nearly all have certain poetical merits, whether you believe them or not. This is what we should expect. Man is a poetical animal, and nothing touches which he does not adore. And touches nothing that he does not adore. Okay, so, but now what do we do? There are, however, two other lines of thought which might lead us to call theology a mere poetry, and these we must consider. So what are those? Well, the first, it certainly contains elements similar to those that we find in many earlier and even savage religions. So that's the first element. So what's the point here? What's he doing?
Noting that there's a parallel to myth or other myths.
Yes.
And myth would fall in the larger category of poetry. He wants to be careful to answer that possible objection.
Okay.
Christianity is merely.
So do other religious stories have stories of dying and rising gods? Do other stories have stories of human frailty and brokenness? Okay. Those kind of things. So that's the kind of thing. Now, whether light is really thrown on the truth or falsity of Christian religion by the occurrence of similar ideas in pagan religions, I think the answer was very well given a fortnight ago by Mr. Brown. Supposing for purposes of argument that Christianity is true, then it could avoid all coincidence with other religions only on the supposition that all other religions are 100% erroneous. So we say, are they 100% wrong? No, there's some truth there. We all recognize that. So that's the point that he is saying.
Chesterton says something almost identical in The Everlasting Man.
Yes.
So it's exactly the same thing.
So, and as we know, Lewis loved that book, and it was very profoundly important to his thinking. So there's truth in other world religions, and Chesterton had laid that out poetically and beautifully and elegantly, and Lewis is affirming that in this piece. So, but the bottom of the next page, let's see, I gotta make sure I'm in the right place. Okay, this is gonna be your page 9, I think. Yes, the top of page 9. Top of page 9 for you. We should therefore expect to find in the imagination of great pagan teachers and myth makers some glimpse of that theme which we believe to be the very plot of the whole cosmic story, the theme of incarnation, death, and rebirth. So we should expect that, and we should not be surprised that we find that to be the case in all kinds of ways. So he begins this long paragraph, in which he kind of relates the way those things are woven together. Then he gets to the point that he really wants to make about this. So this will be your middle of page 9. So finally, you get, he reads the New Testament and history reigns supreme and the truth is incarnate. Do you know where I am there? Okay.
Is it basically saying this is fact as well as poetry now?
Yes, that's the move he's making. And incarnate is here more than a metaphor. And that's the move. So there's another little essay in God in the Dark. Myth becomes fact. Okay, so this is the move he's making here, and in incarnate is here more than a metaphor. It's not an incidental or accidental resemblance of what, from the point of view of being, is stated in the form of God become man should involve, but from the point of view of human knowledge, the statement myth became fact. The essential meaning of all things came down from the heaven of myth to the earth of history. So this is the form of this argument at this point. Any comment about this move? Does this make sense? You see the value of this move. We have no trouble saying that there is truth and actually similarities. What's distinctive is incarnation. What's distinctive is the experience in history.
As Tolkien says, that Christianity is the true myth.
The true myth.
The myth that really happened.
That it's a humbling to go from myth to fact. As I think I come on with your talk in the beginning, it's a humiliation. It's a loss of glory. I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, it is humiliation, we're told theologically, but
I'm glad you bring that up because it reminds me of that passage in Chesterton. We keep connecting to Chesterton.
Yes.
Chesterton Lewis Tolkien, where Chesterton talks about we grow weary of repetition because we are weak and dying, but God exults in telling the sun to rise again, and he exults in making another daisy and another daisy and another daisy, and it's only our sin and weakness that causes us to be bored by repetition. I wonder if a parallel can be made here and say it's only our sin and our weakness which causes us to think that believing something makes it less aesthetic.
Well, so Rebecca and I were talking about lunchtime about boredom basically being psychological entropy.
Yeah.
So whereas the physical cosmos is actually fallen and broken because the laws of thermodynamics and entropy, but we're also fallen and broken. But if we didn't have a broken entropic psychology, we would never get bored.
Right. Because sin fragments, it breaks, it splits apart, right? So splitting belief and aesthetic and fact and fact. But saying redemption brings them back together, brings back together myth and fact in a vibrant whole and need not lose on either side.
But I think he's suggesting something else as well. And I think this is one of the meaning of the word humiliation here. I think you're absolutely right about the other thing. But when we read the New Testament, there's a kind of oddness about it. We see an ordinary man walking around doing ordinary things for the most part. We see dumb-witted disciples not understanding things that seem obvious to us from our point of view. As he says here, you see a man sleeping in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. Is that the stuff of elaborate mythology? No, that's not what we read about in other places. This is a guy walking dusty roads and getting tired and washing the feet of people. I mean, who does that sort of thing? In fact, that moment is a moment of kind of humiliation, is it not? And is not the cross such a moment? So I think there's levels to this word humiliation here. And because of that, most of his contemporaries didn't pay him any mind, did they? And certainly not the leadership that should have been looking out for such stuff. They didn't even think he was worth much at all. Okay? So I think this is another meaning here of Lewis's use of the word humiliation. And I think driving that is the second chapter of the book of Philippians. He becomes a slave. He becomes a servant, a doulos. And then God exalts him later. That's later. But the incarnation itself is kind of messy business, isn't it? I mean, barn animals and straw and birth is kind of messy stuff, isn't it? Very human stuff. That's the point I think he's making here. But the humiliation of God and the shrinking or condensation of the myth as it becomes fact are also quite real. Quite real. So, where does that take him? How does he come back to the question, is theology poetry? What's next? He's saying something very important about language here. What is he saying?
Which part are we supposed to be looking at here?
It should be right there.
Page 10.
Page 10. On the printed handout. Page 130 in your book, if you have it. So the myth has become fact. It's been brought down to human size. Okay? It's a real incarnation. He's fully human, fully man, and fully God. But what does this now mean about language? What does this do to the original question, is theology poetry? Which is a question about genre and language and meaning and fact and value. What does it do to that question?
Is he addressing Bertrand Russell's position?
Russell's on this list of people who reduces everything to fact, yes.
And words must necessarily describe those facts.
Yes. In fact, he believed in an language that logic was the language. It has to be reducible to symbolic logic, or it's not meaningful at all.
He's using metaphor the entire time.
All the time.
Because we see it, scientists are horrible about that too.
Yes, all the time he's using metaphor. So what's Lewis's point about metaphor then?
It's embedded in our language.
It can't get away from it.
That's how we understand the world.
We are profoundly metaphorical, no matter what we're talking about.
Saying earlier, the most basic form of allegory you get in St. Augustine's book, Christian Doctrine, is conventional science. In other words, words themselves are metaphors because words speak of something else. So we can't actually even think without metaphor.
Yes. And pardon?
Why didn't Bertrand Russell see that? He was brilliant.
Oh, he was brilliant, but he didn't get that one, did he? And some other things as well. But yes, So, and he gives us a little example in this paragraph we just pointed to on page 10, for your page 10. The first person of the Trinity is not the Father of the second in the physical sense. The second person did not come down to earth in the same sense as a parachute, nor ascend into the sky like a balloon, nor did he literally sit at the right hand of the Father. Why then does Christianity talk as if these things did happen? The agnostic thinks that it really does so because those who founded it were quite naive, really ignorant, and believe all the sentiments literally. And we later Christians have gone on using the same language through timidity and conservatism. But is that really the case? So he makes 2 points or 2 questions. What did the early Christians believe? And then we're going to get to 2 in a minute. So is this really a fair statement of the early church, or the language of the New Testament, the patristic fathers and mothers?
I assume he's drawing from Barfield here, but would saving the appearances have come out before
Yes.
this essay?
Yes. So Barfield is part of this. They were friends. They didn't agree all the time. Barfield was a philosopher by training, and they what was the word? Discussed a lot, argued a lot along the way. But Barfield is making a similar point in several of his works. So, how do we read the New Testament? Is the question. Do we actually read the New Testament? Did the early church read the New Testament? Did the early church speak of these things in a naive kind of way? What is this?
I think theology needs to use symbolism just as poetry needs to use symbolism.
Okay.
And philosophy needs to use.
Absolutely. Deeply metaphorical.
Science is too.
And science.
You heard that.
So, now, he does make a distinction that is important. As soon as the issue of anthropomorphism was explicitly before the church in, I think, the 2nd century, it was condemned. The church knew the answer, that God has no body and therefore couldn't sit on a chair. Okay, now he's being a little silly here, but that's really an acknowledgement that the church fathers were aware of what they were doing. It wasn't naivete. It was a deep understanding of the metaphorical nature of language itself.
And the new atheists are still making those kind of lame,
Yes.
reductionist interpretations of theology, right? With their flying spaghetti monster.
Oh, yes.
Well, and
So it hasn't gone away.
And you hear that when people are translating, like when the Bible is had to be translated in some African religions, that they have had to change the literalism of it in order to get the meaning
Yes.
the same as we had it.
They have to find a similar metaphor or it won't communicate the right
That
things.
fits them,
Yes.
fits their culture.
Yes. Exactly.
It strikes me, there's a similarity, I think, when you're trying to describe something to a child. You select an image that they would be familiar with, and then convey that image and show them how what you're describing is something that's a little bit more sophisticated than they can understand. How it translates into something else. And so much of what was in early church literature was they were trying to explain something very complicated and sophisticated to an audience that would be more familiar with other things, like the mythology that they were surrounded with in Rome or Greek. And so the relationship was used to help an immature Christian to appreciate and understand what was being introduced to the world at that time. And the same thing applies in the Old Testament.
That's right.
These were things that were not easily understood. And so the way of describing them, just like with a child.
And we still have trouble understanding them sometimes, don't we?
And it wasn't just the early Christians. Think about all the church with stained glass windows to show the stories.
That's right.
Oh,
The
that's
Torah
right,
form.
yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, we get to number 2, which is on your page 11, okay? And the paragraph right before that. The earliest Christians were not so much like a man who mistakes the shell for the kernel as like a man carrying a nut which he hasn't yet cracked. The moment it is cracked, he knows which part to throw away. Till then, he holds on to the nut, not because he's a fool, but because he isn't. Oh, that's a great line. Okay? That's good stuff. That's good stuff. Okay, so point number 2 then he's going to make is we're invited to restate our belief in a form free from metaphor and symbol. The reason we don't is that we can't. We can, if you like, say God entered history instead of saying God came down to earth. But of course, entered is just as metaphorical as came down. You have only substituted horizontal or undefined movement for vertical movement. We can make our language duller. We cannot make it less metaphorical. So he quotes, says a wonderful quote. Do you know this man? You guys encountered anybody? Richards? Richard was the most important literary critic in England at the time.
He would say that again.
Yeah, he was the most important literary critic in the mid-20th century.
Which is why none of us have heard of him today.
Yeah.
Worth reading now.
Yeah.
No one's heard of him.
Nobody reads him now. But at the time...
excuse me, but that Lewis, said that fashions are always coming and going, but mostly going.
Mostly going, that's right. That's right. So this is at the very bottom of your page 11 and the top of page 12. So he quotes Richards from Principles of Literary Criticism, 1924, which rightly said is not read at all today. If you mention it to anybody in a literature department now, they'll go, who? What? What? Only that part of the cause of a mental event which takes effect through incoming sensory impulses, or through effects of past sensory impulses, can be said to be thereby known. The reservation, no doubt, involves complications. Does anybody know what that meant?
Some criticism here. I think he just emptied his statement of all validity.
Isn't he just saying that it's all about experience, memory of experience, but he didn't say it. That's what he's trying to say badly.
Yes. But notice the language. It's through, and those are metaphors. Okay? So in his effort to reduce it all to a kind of stark empiricism, Richards resorts to metaphor. That's the beauty of this. It's a great example. Okay? So now to moving toward the main part of the argument. Believe it or not, we're just getting to the really good stuff. Okay, we had to kind of, but now you understand. We understand the nature of that original question, the title, and how tricky it is. And he handles this deftly. He turns it back. He takes it apart, and he helps us understand what's really at stake here. Any questions before we go on? Are we doing all right? I've lost all track of time. So let me check. Oh, we're doing all right. Okay. So this is your page, page 12. Page 12. For all these reasons, then, I think, though we knew even before Freud and that the heart is deceitful, that those who accept theology are not necessarily being guided by taste rather than reason. The picture so often painted of Christians huddling together on an ever narrower strip of beach while the incoming tide of science mounts higher and higher corresponds to nothing in my own experience. That grand myth, which I asked you to admire only a few minutes ago, is not for me a hostile novelty breaking in on my traditional beliefs. On the contrary, that cosmology is what I started from. Deepening distrust and final abandonment of it long preceded my conversion to Christianity. Long before I believed theology to be true, I had already decided that the popular scientific picture, at any rate, was false. So then, where did that leave us? Where do we go from here? What is he saying here? What's the heart of this paragraph?
Well, his distrust of the myth that, or in this specific case, cosmology, but the whole of scientism, that he's picked out that there's central problems with this, quote, historical science, which is really not a part of operational science, that make it unbelievable. It depends on the validity of inferences, which can't be proven.
All right.
Like Plantic is where the real problem lies.
Yes, yes. So the real problem lies with the philosophical assumptions that guide that. The materialistic naturalism that confines science. So the problem is not with science or the methodologies of science per se, but the confining of that within a box, a philosophical box of materialistic naturalism that says that all that is can be contained within the natural box, nothing else. Nothing else. So he puts it in terms of, yet those who ask me to believe this world picture also ask me to believe that reason is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproducts of mindless matter at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. Now this is in one sentence, the third chapter of Miracles. If you want to read that, you can get a fuller picture of that. But if you want to get a more modern picture of that, read Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist philosopher who argues that materialistic naturalism in its neo-Darwinian form cannot explain human self-consciousness or human reason, either one.
Or human language.
Or language, but
The materialist takes it on faith.
completely.
To say our reason corresponds to reality.
That's right.
Or the vast amount of information in the biological world, or the precise orientation of the physical constants.
So, the next section, which is for all these, the next page would be page 13. Is that, 13. There are real difficulties with what he's talking about, and with the materialistic, naturalistic view of the world, and he traces those for the next paragraph or so, and those are pretty obvious, direct kinds of things. You find anything in there particular that you want to address, find interesting, different. This argument's been picked up now by a number of people, and so this is stuff that perhaps you've read in other texts. The basic argument here. Yes, yes. It's in Orthodoxy picked up here, and then Plantico repeats it, and other people repeat it.
It's interesting that he mentions Arthur Balfour on page 4, and there's a foreshadowing of this argument in Arthur Balfour. I think that was the book that was on C.S. Lewis's top 10 books that most influenced his thinking, right? And I just thought it's interesting, you get all the way to page 13 where he's unpacking this a little bit, and he doesn't mention Balfour again.
Not again, but some of those things are foreshadowed there, yes. Some of this argument. So,
Somebody know who what the Bergsonian critique is?
yeah, Bergson was a French philosopher, last part of the 19th century, early 20th century, and his view was captured in a kind of picture of what he called elan vita, kind of the life force. So the image in your mind that you have to kind of have is a picture of a fountain. Say, go to a beautiful European city with a beautiful central square and a fountain, and the fountain is shooting water straight up, and at the very tip, just before the water begins to fall, that's life. That's the edge, and that's the life force, and we're the product of that. We are that moment, and then we fall off. That's it. And so all of Bergson's thought is driven that way. It's just a life force. So this is kind of what's happened with I mentioned mind and cosmos. So he doesn't want to go to God. He knows that neo-Darwinian materialistic naturalism cannot provide a case for reason or self-consciousness, so he opts for panpsychism, okay, which is sort of Bergson on steroids, okay? It's sort of a spiritual component of all physical matter that we can't see, touch, feel, or handle, but is there, that makes physical matter capacity, gives physical matter a capacity for 2 minutes, he says, for life. Okay, so we got to jump to the best thing here. Okay, so go to the bottom of page. This is 14. The bottom of page 14, and this long paragraph is one of the most beautiful paragraphs in all of Lewis's writing, in my opinion. It is superb. I was taught at school, when I had done a sum, to prove my answer. The proof or verification of my Christian answer to the cosmic sum is this. When I accept theology, I may find difficulties at this point or that in harmonizing it with some particular truths which are embedded in the mythical cosmology derived from science. But I can get in or allow for science as a whole. Granted that reason is prior to matter, and that the light of that primordial reason illuminates finite minds, I can understand how men should come by observation and inference to know a lot about the universe they live in. If, on the other hand, I swallow the scientific cosmology as a whole. Now, understand that it's not science per se, but science as materialistic naturalism. Okay? If I swallow that by as a whole, then not only can I not fit in Christianity, but I can't even fit in science. If minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry in the long run on the meaningless flux of the atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind and the trees. And this is to me the final test. This is how I distinguish dreaming and waking. When I am awake, I can, in some degree, account for and study my dream. The dragon that pursued me last night can be fitted into my waking world. I know that there are such things as dreams. I know that I had eaten an indigestible dinner. I know that a man of my reading might be expected to dream of dragons. But while in the nightmare, I could not have fitted in my waking experience. The waking world is judged more real because it can thus contain the dreaming world. The dreaming world is judged less real because it cannot contain the waking one. For the same reason, I am certain that in passing from the scientific points of view to the theological, I have passed from dream to waking. Christian theology can fit in science, art, morality, and the sub-Christian religions. The scientific point of view cannot fit in any of these things, not even science itself. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. You're clapping, not me, but Lewis.
A good quote from
Give a little context if you can. What was the level of antagonism toward Lewis and the Socratic Club? And did anything change?
Actually, he did not start it, but he came in pretty early in the process, and the whole club was set up for defense of Christianity, and he was the go-to guy most of the time. And so the club itself was not antagonistic, but people came to the club asking the hardest questions they could, and he managed most of them.
In the years that passed, people like Anthony Flew, who was very much an antagonist there, came around very much to embrace atheism.
Right, yeah,
At least deism.
Right, at late, his appreciation of the complexity of biology caused Anthony Flew to change his mind.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being part of this seminar on Is Theology Poetry, and this kind of experience of a seminar approach to thinking through things together. Thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.